All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jeffery Degner. Dr. Degner is assistant professor of economics at Cornerstone University, a fellow at the Mises Institute, and the author of the brand new book, Inflation in the Family: Monetary Policy's Impact on Household Life. In this book, he explains how inflationary policies negatively impact family and society. We will be discussing the impact of inflation on society in the show today. Dr. Jeffery Degner, I am extremely excited to have you on here to talk about this.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. And it's been a privilege to follow your work along with Jacob. And I appreciate everything that you guys are doing. I too am excited to be with you, especially after your recent appearance with Dr. Murphy, who's also he's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. And so it's really a privilege to follow on his heels and further this discussion with you today.
Yeah, and it's really is a perfect segue. I know that you had a conversation with Jacob recently, which should be out by the time this episode is released, and I'll try to put the links to that in the show notes so people can listen to them, because we're kind of focusing on two different aspects of your work. Mm-hmm. But before we get into the argument that you make in your book, talk to us about yourself, your background, how you became an economist, and the work that you do.
Sure. My background is really that I'm an educator, and I have been in public schools for 13 years prior to coming to Cornerstone in 2018. And I came to Cornerstone because I had just completed my master's in applied economics. And as I took on my role here, one of the expectations was to pursue a PhD program. Well, part of the situation was that I'm married with two wonderful daughters and got a mortgage and a full-time job. And so how am I going to pursue a PhD in the traditional American pathway? And the answer is that I couldn't. And so I reached out to some friends at the Mises Institute. Then President Jeff Deist replied via email and said, given the situation, why don't you reach out to Guido Hülsmann at the University of Angers in France? And for one, Guido is someone that I had followed for a few years and was a great admirer of his work. And as it turns out, he was willing to take me on as one of his doctoral students. And through that dissertation process, produced a thesis that's actually called The Family in the Inflation Culture, kind of an awkward title. And most folks might look at that a little bit sideways and be too curious, be confused by that title. So, but I do think it captures what I've really been working on. Now, that dissertation has now been turned into this book, and the title is a little more snappy for marketing purposes. But in any case, really what I've pursued here is how monetary policy and inflationary monetary policy impacts culture as a whole. And then we see a number of consequences that really flow from that. But that's a little on my background and how I came to this work and to get this book out this last June.
Yeah, and Hülsmann has that amazing book. I think it's called The Ethics of Money Production, which dovetails with a lot of the arguments that you make in your book. Just phenomenal research on this. And you're a Christian. You teach at a Christian university, and so this is obviously for us not just a matter of abstract economics, but it's about morality and ethics and theology as well. And so you wrote this book, Inflation in the Family, is kind of an extension of your PhD dissertation. But when did you get interested in the way that monetary policy impacts average people?
Well, I think it was when I first read Dr. Hülsmann's Ethics of Money Production, and that's a little bit of my background story as well. We were talking briefly before going to record here that you're relatively recent to the Austrian school, and I am too. I wasn't even introduced to it until 2010. And it was at that point that I discovered the Mises Institute pretty quickly online with a vast library of resources, videos, free PDF books, an amazing treasure trove of economics, philosophy, history in the Austrian and Libertarian tradition. So I started diving in there, and the Ethics of Money Production, I can't remember if it was near the top of the webpage, but as a title, it really caught my eye, and downloaded that thing and began reading it. And in chapter 13, there was a phrase that still rings in my ears today. He wrote that fiat inflation is a juggernaut, a really powerful word, an unstoppable force of social, economic, cultural, and spiritual destruction. And then at the end of that paragraph, there's a little footnote, and Dr. Holzman refers to Goethe's work and the story of Faust and his deal with the devil, and that the devil presents him with paper money as a pathway to wealth. And he furthers that footnote and says that there is a need for research into the diabolical nature of fiat currency. So not only from a kind of social scientist aspect, but also as a Christian looking at genuine evil in the world, and that the powers, the principalities of this world are influenced by the evil one himself. That too was a very compelling statement that I wholeheartedly agree with. And I think we'll probably touch on some of those themes as we roll this discussion forward.
Yeah, and I think we need to start out with the most fundamental concept that we're going to be discussing today, and that is the definition of inflation.
Yep.
Now, I've talked about it on my show several times. I've talked to Bob Murphy about it, but I think that if there's an economic concept that Americans just do not understand, it's the concept of inflation. So define the term inflation for us and talk to us about how the Federal Reserve controls it.
Sure thing. So inflation, properly defined, is money creation beyond reserves. Now, that might sound a little technical, but we have lots of euphemisms for this. The Federal Reserve and its member banks are essentially engaged in printing or creating money out of thin air through the creation of new credit that is not based on reserves that are held in, say, bank vaults. All right, so that's the quick and dirty definition, but the Fed creates policies that not only encourage this and spur that activity forward, but they also serve, they being the Federal Reserve, also serves as a backstop for when banks create too much of this new credit, find that their borrowers can't pay it back, and when they're on the verge of bankruptcy, the banks can fall back on the Federal Reserve as a so-called lender of last resort. And so this creates a backstop or a fallback for, at the very least, being gracious, you could say unscrupulous banking decisions. Or others in the Austrian tradition have said that they have a fallback for the fraud that they have committed. Whichever way you want to phrase that, that's the world that we're living in. And inflation, its number one beneficiary are the banks themselves, who create new credit and earn interest back as profit. But just as helped in this process is the central government, which, as we know, loves to borrow money to the tune of $37 trillion in our current situation. And so that's a little bit about the definition and kind of the mechanics of inflation in our day and age. And the confusion comes in where modern economists in the early 20th century began to define inflation differently as a general increase in the rise of prices. And that's what most folks on the street think of as inflation today. When they say milk and eggs and gas becoming more expensive, that's what most people think of. But the root causes of inflation are far deeper and far more foundational to all of the interactions that we have in the marketplace.
Yeah, and it is really funny when you go back and read the work of someone like Ludwig von Mises, who wrote in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he was talking about the way that definition was being manipulated back then. So we're talking, this is like a 70-year-old phenomenon, and I think the conclusion that he comes to is that it's a very convenient way for the people that are causing economic disruptions by printing money to shift the blame to other people. And there are, in that sense, it is kind of a way of like propagandizing the American public into accepting the fact that we have to have a central bank and that we have to have fiat currency. And within Austrian economics, there's a term for the kind of distorting effects that money printing has on the economy, and that's called the Cantillon effect. So could you explain the Cantillon effect to my audience, and how does that damage our economy in ways that are oftentimes imperceptible to the average American observer?
Yeah, this is one of two main effects that the Austrians have discovered and brought forward through economic theory when we have this inflationary mechanism at play. So the first is the Cantillon effect, which you've mentioned. The second is the business cycle, which we can maybe touch on later. But this is one that I think deserves a lot more attention than it has gotten. In modern parlance and kind of the populist phrases of the day, everybody's familiar with the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's really a shorthand, sort of bumper sticker way of describing what the Cantillon effect is. So the quick history on this is that Richard Cantillon was an Irishman. He was born in Ireland and moved to France later in his life. And he wrote an essay on economic theory where he described new money production, but in very much the traditional sense, the sense where you have entrepreneurs taking risks, buying mines for gold or silver. They dig it out of the ground and they melt it down and they mint it. And they, as they engage in this kind of business, will be the first beneficiaries. They will see profits from this process as long as their costs don't exceed those revenues. So, in a very simple sort of business sense, the creators of new money do have a profit that no one else has quite realized yet. But in a certain way, this is no different than if you have an entrepreneur who comes up with a new type of snow boot that consumers really like. Of course, they will go ahead and sell their new goods, hopefully at a profit, and they will benefit, and so will their households. So, in this sense, what Cantillon is describing in his essay on economic theory is pretty straightforward and simple. But the problem comes in a fiat currency regime, where you have not just a one-time kind of high-cost activity like gold mining, minting, and so forth, but when you have a low-cost approach to money production, I'll use air quotes there,
Right.
that is virtually costless. You print it off, and the first recipients, the creators of this new money, who are banks in our modern situation, and their first recipients. Who do they lend out to first in the greatest quantities and at the lowest interest rates? Well, in our modern context, that would be the federal government in Washington, D.C. And so it's the creators and first recipients of this new money production, which now is costless. It is QE, or quantitative easing, to infinity, and the benefits are massive to those who are the first recipients in and around the Washington, D.C. area. And so we think sometimes in vague terms, the corporations profit. Well, the people who work for the corporations and their households are the beneficiaries of this new money. They're able to purchase goods and services and start bidding them up, while everyone else has not seen an increase in income, and they are then faced with higher prices. Those folks who are farther down the line of these new expenditures. And the classic case, you can see this with your own eyes. If you look at the expenditures toward government and government activities around Washington, D.C., and wouldn't you know it, that's some of the most expensive real estate, housing, private schooling, cars, you name it, in the entire country. So the early beneficiaries, or the early recipients, rather, of this new money production, they are the most benefited by this new money production process. And those who are receiving that new money expenditure later down the line are simply left with probably the same wages they've always had, but now they're faced with much higher prices for all the things you can imagine.
I'm glad you brought up the business cycle, because I do think that we should address that before we start getting into some of the specifics, because while the Cantillon effect allows us to see maybe some of the microeconomic impacts of monetary policy, how it impacts individuals and distorts the economy, the business cycle is really kind of the macro perspective on what this does to our economy as a whole. So talk to us about the Austrian business cycle and how money production contributes to that.
Sure. So this is really the second thing that Austrians have brought forward. I mentioned the Cantillon effect, but now the business cycle theory that the Austrians have produced, and that has its roots in Ludwig von Mises' work, Friedrich Hayek's work as well. So what we describe happening here, it is closely related to the Cantillon effect, but now we can take it to more of that macro level. So with the new money creation going into the hands of certain firms, we will see these firms facing a lower interest rate. And this is really the key. With new money production, this is going to tend to reduce the overall interest rate. So let's talk about how that impacts firms. Businesses with a lower interest rate are led to believe that there are more resources available in the economy for them to engage in long-term projects. And just think of this, it's a pretty simple formula. If I'm a business person and I want to engage in a long-term business project that's going to involve borrowing money, then a lower interest rate is something that I'm willing to jump at, right? I'll take that 4% interest rate at 10 years versus, say, a 7% interest rate, where I might need to shorten that project time span. So businesses engage in longer term projects which require more resources than they are initially aware of in the first place. So that's what happens to businesses. And they engage in these projects where they won't come to fruition for another 7, 8, 9 years. Meanwhile, on the other side of the macroeconomy, households with lower interest rates tend to engage in overconsumption. And that makes sense to us as well. It's not hard for most people to understand that if interest rates are suppressed and I'm only getting 0.5% on my CD at the bank, well, I've got two choices with my income. Do I go ahead and be really frugal and tighten my belt while prices are going up and save it? No. Professor Holzman uses a really powerful line again in the ethics of money production. In an inflationary environment, that is financial suicide.
Yeah.
And so you have a movement, a shift towards consumerism and consumeristic behavior on the household side. So when we combine these two realities, longer term projects by firms where products don't show up for 7, 8, 9 years down the road, and more consumption and less savings on the part of households, when we reach that point 8, 9, 10 years down the road, and these firms have produced these, let's say, wonderful new cars with all kinds of bells and whistles and new technology, all this investment, and they sell it at a high price, consumers and households don't have the savings for a down payment. They are unable to afford these newly produced goods that are the result of that what's called malinvestment. And that's when the malinvestment kind of shows up. Firms don't realize their error until the product has sort of hit the shelves or cars have hit the lot. And now consumers can't afford those goods and services, that the economy turns to a bust phase. And that's this business cycle that Austrians refer to. And it is not an inevitable part of economies. It is the result of monetary policy. And so that's one of the important observations and conclusions of the Austrians, is that business cycles are not inevitable. They are the result of policymakers' choices, and especially the choice to increase money supply beyond reserves, suppressing interest rates, and with the results that the consequences of what I just described.
Yeah, a lot of the people that are listening to my show have families themselves, and so they understand how expensive it is to fill up their tank with gasoline and to buy groceries for their kids. And this really is kind of at the root of all of those problems. Now, I know that you spend most of your episode with Jacob talking about his impacts on the family, but before we talk about some of the other specifics, maybe just explain to my audience, why should people with families be concerned about inflation?
Well, some of the things, there's a big discussion right now about inflation in the housing market. And there are other items, but I think this is the one that is most glaring for folks. But of course, it's not the only one. You can talk about your grocery bill, the amount it takes to fill up your gas tank, and especially since this inflation, and I will use that word selectively, I'll say the price increases, a little distinct from inflation, the price increases we've seen in housing, these basic goods and services. But there are other areas as well. I work in higher education, and if you track back over the past 20 years, some of the greatest and fastest accelerating prices in the economy are in education, and especially higher education markets. They're only outstripped by price increases in healthcare. Well, what do these kind of three sectors all have in common? Healthcare, higher education, the housing market. Well, you have the government's interventions all over these markets. So you combine these inflationary monetary policies along with government regulation, government subsidy in housing, healthcare, and higher education. And you see families describing the great difficulties around those areas. And to loop it back around to housing, there was some statistics floating around Twitter X a couple weeks ago about how in the 1950s, when it came to housing and families, that about 50% of 30-year-olds in the United States were married homeowners in the 1950s. Right, about half of 30-year-olds. Today, that number is around 13%. 12 to 13% of 30-year-olds are married and homeowners. That is just one statistic that really tells the story of what's happening in terms of delays in family formation, due largely, but not totally, in part to this inflationary and regulatory environment where housing is becoming more and more difficult to afford. And so that speaks to delays in marriage. But if you have to delay marriage further, the natural, dare I say, biological consequence of that is delayed marriage equals fewer total births. And that's not really a social commentary. That's not a moral commentary. Those are just biological facts. And so that is one string of cause and effect when you look at inflationary monetary policy, piling on regulatory limits on houses being built and so on. And then you have these family consequences as a result. So that's just one part of this story in how inflation is impacting family formation and fertility and other family realities.
Well, and I love how you call this inflation culture, because I do think that speaks to the negative effects that this has on our society as a whole, and not just in economic terms. Like, it really is completely changing the fabric of American society. And this is something where, and I feel like you would agree with me in a lot of ways, the problems with American culture that conservatives identify, I completely agree with. But then their solutions are entirely wrong because they always fail to take in the monetary aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know there's a lot of debate among libertarian circles about immigration. But the reason I bring that up is because if you look at some of the conservative talking points and they look at a lack of affordability in housing, they'll say, oh, well, look, all these illegal immigrants have taken housing. Now, okay, yes, there are housing units that have been occupied. But if you think that that's the solution to bring us back down to earth in terms of housing costs, you don't understand the root causes of the problem that we have in the first place. And so what I see a lot of conservative statists doing is just adding more and more layers of intervention into what Austrians have called an intervention spiral. There's another phrase for this that Thorsten Polleit, he's an economist out of Germany, he calls it kind of a similar phenomenon of collective corruption. And that's a really loaded sort of cultural term where collectively, I don't know about you, Alex, I am a homeowner. Yeah, and so there's a real problem where I can sit here and identify the problem and say, boy, we gotta peel back some of that inflationary pressure on housing. But if I do that, that's going to cost me. I mean, my spreadsheet where I track my net worth is going to take a hit if that's the process that we undergo of sort of uprooting these the core interventions that have led us to this problem. So I'm tempted to say, well, tap the brakes. Most people are not even that self-aware, and they say, yeah, keep that inflation going.
Right.
And so
Trump.
This
it's a great example
exactly
of that.
Always pushing for that suppression of interest rates because he and folks in the upper echelons of society are the owners of the kinds of assets whose prices go up under inflationary conditions. And that's what Polleit means by collective corruption. We can identify the problem, we can say it's a problem, but the solution is going to hurt us. And so the motive is to say, well, maybe we could just let this ride for another generation and my kids will figure it out. I don't think that really falls under the category of an attitude of blessing future generations that the Lord is calling us to. So that's what we mean by collective corruption. It is another symptom, a cultural outcome of the inflation culture. And there were three categories that I identified in the book. Largely, I mean, the credit goes to Professor Holzman on this for one being my PhD supervisor, but really guiding and refining these three categories of inflation culture, or you might even say inflation beliefs. And if you want to dip our toe into that category, that would be cool too.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and follow up on that, because I do think that's important. I mean, you really have already kind of built a foundation for how this impacts families, housing prices in particular, and the way that it distorts our, like, kind of the moral character of our society. So yeah, maybe follow that up. I think it'd be good to go down that path.
Yeah, so three categories that I identified, again with Professor Holzman's help here, were first a category of enhanced economic inequality. And I need to be real specific on this because we describe the Cantillon effect, right? The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And indeed, that is the case, but I have to be very specific here. That is the case with earned income over time. And we do see that pattern. However, we've had an intervention piled on top of that. And we can think of this happening with the welfare state, the bringing forward of the so-called Great Society in the 1960s, where you had milder economic inequality at that time. And so with the Great Society legislation, you start to see taxes applied more to the wealthy, and those benefits sliding into the households and pockets of those on the lower third or so of society. And so there's been some writing here in recent years, and dear, we're saying the same thing. Dr. Thornton at the Mises Institute has delivered lectures the last few years detailing how the welfare state has shifted overall income. Now, that's different from earned income. And it is indeed the case that when we account for the transfers from the wealthy to the poor, that the income at the end of the day is a little more level. My concern in describing the Cantillon effect is that the earned income is indeed increasing in inequality. And so what's the cultural effect of this? Well, one is when you pile on that intervention of the welfare state into the lives of the poor, they get rewarded for doing the things that keep them poor. Things like not graduating high school, things like having children out of wedlock, things like not getting married. These are beneficial to you if you're in the recipient class of the welfare state. And so there is a lot of discussion, and I'm here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have folks at the Acton Institute who have paid a lot of attention. Scholars like Anthony Bradley have brought forward the importance in the Black community and poor communities of restoring the family. Well, my argument, I know his argument would be as well, that goes across the board, right? That's not just a problem for minority families. It's a problem for households of all backgrounds, that if you take these steps to make you poor and you have the welfare state to cover that, that will sustain and perpetuate this problem. Here at Cornerstone, one of my discussions with our students here is, and it always hits them in a funny way, but I ask them to write down on their notes, what are 5 things you could do to ensure that you will be poor in 5 years? Right. Because it's an economics class. Normally we're thinking about, what are processes to building a higher standard of living and so on. So it kind of hits them funny. And then they start talking, discussing. And of course, it's these things, right? It's have a kid. It's, move out on my own, run up credit card debt, these kinds of things. And they can identify the path to poverty and, the pitfalls that are there. So that's one category. That's a kind of a long explanation, but this rising economic inequality on earned income is a feature. It's not a bug. It is a feature of an inflationary monetary system. And so that breeds these kinds of cultural outcomes. So economic inequality, that's a major problem. There's two other categories, but before I move on to those, there's a book by William Tucker. I've alerted a couple podcast audiences to this book. It was written in 2014, and it's just called Marriage and Civilization. Now, Tucker is actually coming at marriage from sort of an evolutionary standpoint, not a Christian, but he does have an interesting subtitle on the book. It says, How Monogamy Made Us Human. Interesting subtitle. But what he points out is that you really have in societies, broadly speaking, you have a conflict between monogamous behavior in society and polygamous behavior in society. And as I read his book, he said that these sorts of cultures, they cannot coexist. That's one thing. But the other thing that he said is that monogamous cultures are characterized by very high economic income and wealth inequality. And it stands to reason that if you have a very small, select group of very wealthy males, and all the rest of the males in society have job instability, are subject to poverty, very poor labor market conditions, and no wealth, that polygamy would stand to reason, right, that this would kind of prevail in that sort of society. And he further details that those kinds of societies are very violent because you have a bunch of unattached, despondent young men who are ripe for radicalization. So this is yet another downstream symptom of rising economic inequality. And so even though people might say, well, why are we talking about polygamy in the United States? It's outlawed. Right. Well, look at the behaviors that you see. Yeah. I would make the argument that we have extra legal polygamy.
I would agree.
And you know who the biggest polygamist of them all is? Is the welfare state itself.
Yeah.
It is able to provide for thousands and thousands of women with multiple children who are not uniting with the fathers of those children, but rather uniting themselves to one big daddy, if you will. That's a little crude, I know, but that's the shock value of that statement, I think, is a worthy thing to bring forward, because that's actually what we're living with. And I think that this extra legal polygamy versus traditional Christian family life is part of the polarization that we see in our society today. It's not the whole story, but I think it's a missing part of the story that we can definitely bring forward. So that's all the cascading consequences of economic inequality, which arises to a much higher degree than it otherwise would when you have a monetary system that is so inflationary.
Yeah, and I think that, to me, as especially as a Christian observing all of this, well, it's frustrating that none of this is natural. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. This is not the normal course of economic affairs. Yeah. And it really is a case where, and again, this is where I think like a lot of right wingers get this wrong, is that they look at people that live in poverty as if, they've just made a bunch of bad decisions and they're filthy people. And if only they were smart like us, they wouldn't be there. But some of that is true. Like, people do, and adults have to deal with the consequences of their choices, but the inflation culture that we have created makes it way easier for them to make choices. And then you have a situation in which these people are producing children who are raised up in an environment where that's their expectation for what normal is. And so it becomes a generational issue. And in a lot of ways, like, if you step back and look at it with even a little bit of compassion, you see these people are getting screwed over, and it's at the behest of the wealthiest and most powerful people in our country. And no one seems to be able to diagnose the problem.
Yeah, and that is an interesting thing. I mean, before we move on to these other categories of inflation culture, it is an interesting thing. There have been articles written on this where sort of the financial, political, the celebrity elites, they talk about and endorse and encourage all kinds of degenerate behavior among broader society, but they themselves, for the most part, you have these high-profile divorces and these kinds of things, but by and large, that class of people, they live conventional, dare I say, conservative lifestyles with respect to family life. And that's something that Charles Murray, I know he's a controversial author for a couple of reasons, but setting that aside for a moment, in his 2012 book, Coming Apart, he just kind of details what's been happening, not just in minority communities with respect to family life, but among whites. And I think that Murray's writing of that book, I think it was a little bit of a mea culpa for writing the bell curve. Think of that book what you may, but he was pointing out, look, historically, when we have talked about family breakdown in the United States, it's always been kind of pointing the finger and looking over at minorities and saying, well, that's the source of your problem in family life. All the statistics point to a smaller group generating these kind of aggregate statistics that show a negative picture on family life. Well, what Murray said is that no, that is not the case. That across the board, you see the dissolution, what I later call the liquidation of traditional family life out of the middle and lower classes. Now, Murray pointed to a different potential cause. And in that book, he states outright that he's not looking to explain why this has happened. He's just kind of detailing the statistics. He hints at a couple causes, but I wanted to spring forward from that book and say, look, let's talk about the actual causes that are affecting everyone, regardless of racial or ethnic background. And again, all of the sort of the clues along the line of what Murray had written point to monetary inflationism. And so that's where this book came from. And so, but yeah, I'd love to touch on the other two categories.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So the second category, I'll be a little more brief on these, is the enhancement of the debt culture, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the mechanical realities of living in an inflationary world, and houses is always a good example because this is one that people understand. One of the best ways to gain greater net worth for most people in the middle class or even the lower classes is to leverage, that is to say borrow early and often and as much as you can in order to get yourself into a house that is capable with its square footage and get in the right neighborhood where you can see those property values increase. And at the end of whatever time frame you're looking at, 5-10 years, go ahead and sell at a profit. Now, that is encouraging people to get into debt rather than to save for the future and have a very hefty down payment. One of the ways I've illustrated this inflationary culture and our rush into debt these days is to talk to our young people at Cornerstone University in our classes about my grandparents. My grandfather graduated high school but did not go to college. He was a blue-collar worker, had a little bit of GI money, and grandma stayed at home. Yeah. And with that GI money and with that kind of standard approach to household finance, save 10%, put it in the bank at 7% interest.
Right.
In a few years, you will have a nice down payment for a home. And my grandfather was able to build with his own money a 2-story brick house that still stands pretty nicely today. And grandma didn't have to go to work until my dad went to college and he needed a few spending bucks. What do my wife and I have to do? My wife and I both have advanced degrees. We both work full time to borrow on a house that is frankly of inferior quality. So what has happened in that 70-year time span? And I have to explain to the students, it's not that it's not that he's a smart man, but it wasn't intelligence. It wasn't hard work. It wasn't those things. It wasn't that he had superior moral character and just was more frugal than us. No, we are indeed frugal, but our money is different. The dollars that I earn are different dollars than the ones that he earned. And so as a result, we have got to rush into debt in order to purchase assets like a home to outpace that inflation so we can stay ahead of the other rising costs. And so debt culture has a lot of problems. It leads to enhanced household like economic and financial fragility. And in worst case scenarios, you have people really abusing credit cards for consumption, right? For consumption purposes. And it's gotten to the point now where you have young people who are ordering their DoorDash on credit.
Right.
Getting your burrito with 15% interest.
Right.
This is where that debt culture has taken us. And so for young men who are saddled with debt, this isn't even to mention the debt for higher education, but it just sets you behind. And so the rise of debt culture, where for my grandparents, it was borderline shameful to take out debt. And now you've got 17-year-olds who are waiting until they turn 18 so they can get a credit card to pump their credit score. And that's very common. And so that's the debt culture, and the cascading effects from there are alarming, to say the least.
Well, and again, from a Christian perspective, people should be able to. Money is the medium of exchange. It should be honest. It should be stable over time. You should be able to engage in wise long-term financial planning through hard work, thrift, and savings. Like that should be the way that it works. But now it's like you said, if you want to get ahead, you have to purchase assets, you have to consume, and you have to play in the stock market. Now, all of these things benefit a very small number of people at the expense of everyone else. And it's just so frustrating, again, to look at the way that our society tries to diagnose these problems, and they come to all of the wrong conclusions. But you're absolutely right. Like this is this has such a tremendous impact on literally every single experience that we have in the modern world.
And I know that certain folks are not huge fans of Dave Ramsey, right? But one of the first scriptures that he brings forward is he's not lying. He's reading Proverbs just like you and I can, and where it says that the borrower is slave to the lender. This speaks to the importance of paying your debts in a timely fashion. And so if you have more and more debt and more debt service to pay every month, that changes how you approach work.
It does.
You must meet those payments. Otherwise, you potentially wind up on the street. You wind up without transportation, with a car being repossessed, or on the street because of a home foreclosure. These are very real threats. And because of inflation, rising prices, rising prices in other categories, as people take a look at their monthly budgets, you must prioritize the debt repayment and start skimping on food for your kids. And this could be a whole other discussion about the inflationary world. Another Austrian economist, Saifedean Ammous, Saif, has written a number of books, and he's a big proponent of Bitcoin. And quick off ramp here, but he's got a chapter in one of his books on fiat food, making the argument that because of these rising prices in food markets, that folks have got to seek out cheaper alternatives, cheaper substitutes. And very often that means lower quality, less healthy food. And we see all kinds of health consequences arising from this debt payment first, and then everything else falling after that. And so the debt culture has numerous consequences that kind of flow into a number of different streams that most folks just think, oh, it's just corporate greed.
Right.
Oh, it's the gas station owner gouging me. Oh, it's the grocery store owner who's living high on the hog. Little do they know that grocery stores are some of the lowest margin businesses that you can possibly go into, right? But
my wife's in grocery marketing, so I know all about that.
Yeah. And so this, again, we wind up scapegoating. We wind up pointing fingers at the wrong culprits. And the culprit of the inflationary central bank largely goes unnoticed. But the Austrians, Murray Rothbard especially, was very keen to point out that this form of taxation is something that most folks don't understand. They don't really realize the source of it. And so if those two things are true, they don't know who to address. They don't know where the grievance genuinely lies. Instead, they point at their neighbor, who's the grocery store owner, instead of looking at the central bank. And so this leads me to think about the banking industry as a whole. And this is the third cultural category of the inflation culture that I've written about. And that is the enhancement or the growth of moral hazard. And we can think of this predominantly in the banking sector. The initial creation of the Federal Reserve, the excuse for it was that we needed to have a lender of last resort. So that if and when banks make bad decisions, oh shucks, it just happens to them, right? That they can fall back in a bank and depositors will not lose their funds, right? This is a very plausible story for why this was necessary. These were the reasons given to the public for why a central bank was needed back in 1913. Now, what is that process called? Well, we call that process of certain groups or individuals being sort of goaded or encouraged towards more risky behavior and being given a fallback mechanism so that they behave more recklessly, and then you bail them out, and then they can come out and act more recklessly in the future. This continual escalation of risk is really the consequence of moral hazard. Another brief definition of moral hazard is taking on private risks because you have socialized, the payment is socialized. Someone else takes care of it. And so there are a lot of different ways where we can see that moral hazard manifests in the banking industry, but we also see it in individuals. All right, this entire culture is sort of becomes saturated in that kind of behavior. And when I think about risky behaviors, I become very concerned for young men. As a Christian, I'm working at a college campus, but as they look at the inflationary world and they see that banks have a fallback, there's the danger that some young men engage in sport gambling with credit cards.
Yeah.
I mean,
I know some of those young men that do that.
and it really breaks my heart because I'm sure you would testify to the same thing. I have such a blessed and wonderful marriage with my wife coming up on 25 years here. But if I were 19 years old, acquired a credit card, and dug myself into that kind of financial hole by the time I was of marriageable age and had met my wife, she wouldn't look twice.
Right.
And that is one of my concerns, is that, again, these problems manifest into household life, into family life, delays in marriage, and these things that we've discussed. And so this is deeply concerning to me because I have daughters
right.
who are now coming into marriageable age, and we have prayed for their husbands since day one. And so pray that they'll be financially wise, they'll be godly young men, guiding and bathing our daughters in the scriptures as they're called to do, loving them like Christ. But man, when you got these debts and that becomes your primary overriding concern, man, it's a little harder to love Jesus. I mean, I think that it can be as plain as that criticism that comes from a lot of our pulpits, finger wagging at young men for materialism and for pornography. I am desperate for these young men because of the financial, social pressures that they're facing. And young men are in a tough spot. And when young men are in a tough spot, what does that do? It goes back to what we talked about. It drives younger women into non-marriage, or for those who are less virtuous, it drives them into the arms of the state.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered so much ground in the last 45 minutes. We got about 10 or 15 minutes left. Yeah. And I want to address a couple of issues that I think are very relevant for Christians, especially Christians that have our perspective on economics and politics. And Dr. Murphy and I touched on this a little bit in the episode that he appeared on a few weeks back for my show. But we have been, as a country, at war my entire life. I'm 36 years old, and there's never been a year when we've not been bombing some country that no one can find on a map 6,000 miles away from us, right? And one of the really interesting things about studying monetary policy is realizing that that is one of the primary drivers of American imperialism and militarism. So talk about the way that inflation in terms of increasing the money supply is used to drive our never-ending wars.
Well, one of the key phrases, again, I'm going to give you a bumper sticker statement here that really catches the essence of it. And I can't remember if it was maybe Ron Paul repeated this line. For some reason, I'm thinking Randolph Bourne might have said this, famous anti-war thinker back in World War I. But the phrase that fiat currency is death fuel is very apt. Yeah. Is very apt. Now, we have wonderful scholarship done at the Mises Institute and elsewhere that point to the impact of the central banks on the extension of the meat grinder of World War I. And how that is an early picture of how clearly the central banks engaged in extending that conflict in one, you might say, bracketed conflict where you've got initiation and a peace treaty at the end. But what about these never-ending wars? Well, again, you can't. If people were taxed for these wars, they would not be sustained. You would have a tax revolt. Rothbard points this out, that taxing for war is a better option than inflating for war, because the average person in public doesn't realize how that war is really being funded. And once again, they look at their grocery bill 6 months down the road and start getting angry at the grocer, when in fact the source of this consumer inflation really is generated by the inflation that funds the warfare state. And so that's part and parcel of the modern warfare state. And of course, this process of, kind of circling back to our first part of the discussion, the households that benefit the most by the warfare state are those who have stock or work for, let's name the names: Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, all these folks.
Yeah, GE, Boeing, all of them.
And again, that's that collective corruption. Maybe giving the benefit of the doubt, maybe you have folks working for those corporations who genuinely, they've gone to war, they see the horrors of it, they themselves have been suffering from PTSD or other injuries, and maybe at that individual level they abhor war, but in working for these places they engage in that collective corruption, right? To peel back on the warfare state would mean the end of their careers, their finances, and their ability to service their debts, right? So these things are all connected, and they reach all the way down to household life and the decisions that we make around where we live, what kind of careers we choose, what sort of employers we go to work for, that bring us into really difficult ethical questions. That if you peel back the welfare state, and the monetary, the central bank, we would not be running into so many of these collective corruption situations, these ethical dilemmas. And in that sense, we become freed from that kind of evil, that kind of internal conflict. And to me, that sounds like a little bit better world to live in.
Yeah. Well, the final question I want to ask you before I just kind of get your general opinion on some resources that people can use to understand these ideas better, just has to do with why this is relevant for Christians. So I think a very easy connection, at least from my perspective, is that, I was in ministry at one point, and you have to fund all of these programs with money. And so as inflation occurs and the value of money decreases, it's much harder for churches, especially small to middle-sized churches, to fund these programs and hire ministers and do all of the things that actually enable churches to spread the gospel. So there's that effect. And then you have all of the kind of cultural and moral and consumeristic impacts of inflation as well. I don't even want to say beyond all of that, because that's a mountain of terrible things. But why is it that, because when I most of the Christians in my life, if they've ever heard about the Federal Reserve or inflation, it's been from talking to me, right? Like these ideas don't get out there very easily. But why should Christians care about this? And why should Christians want to understand how this system of inflation, this inflation culture that we have, works?
Well, I'm going to go somewhere here, and I think I've only uttered this to maybe a half dozen other people, but I want to walk through and justify what I'm going to say. We mentioned earlier how in a debt culture, right, it saturates us. We just think it's natural. Like every 17-year-old is like, well, yeah, I got to take out student loans. Right. Yeah, of course, I've got to, leverage massive amounts to get into the housing market. Debt is natural. Well, we point to the scripture that the borrower is slave to the lender. And so we are bringing our children into debt enslavement because of the Federal Reserve. That's the core of it. That's the genesis of it. And so we're enslaving future generations. Now, I don't know about you, as you've been in ministry. When my wife and I were first young and married, we were not making, it was difficult to make ends meet. Yes. And we did. I had a job in Southern California, and we were as frugal as we could be. Our daughter had, just come into kindergarten and was outgrowing her clothes. And no matter what we did, we had to go into debt little by little, more and more every single month. And we essentially got into a challenging spot. We were able to move away from Southern California to a more affordable part of the country, Southwest Michigan. And as we started to work through that debt in our personal household situation, I was counseled by one of our elders at our church. And he said, look, I know you want to be generous. I know you want to fulfill your vows to the Lord when it comes to giving, but I want to see that debt paid off before you start giving. And I don't know how you've counseled, but there is some wisdom to that, because Paul is calling us to pay the debts that we owe. And it's not abundantly, obviously clear that that shouldn't be a priority over giving. And you have a very large percentage of churches, especially in rural areas, that are not in the areas that are geographically benefiting from the inflation. Those smaller, mid-sized churches are the ones where you have people who are loaded up with those debts, making giving more difficult, making the practical needs of everyday ministry more difficult. And so that's a lot of background for what I'm about to say next. Christians in the past, I think especially of Wilberforce and his attack on slavery. And we've already said that the borrower is slave to the lender, right? Wilberforce was operating in a world where everybody thought that, well, kidnapping, enslavement, and sale of people, like, that's just natural. That's just the way things work. That's a part of society. It's inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. And through moral, fortitude, clarity from the scriptures. I mean, you just have to look to Deuteronomy. Anyone who enslaves, sells, or who kidnaps, enslaves, and sells a person, the scriptures call for the death penalty of doing this. Yeah. So there's no moral ambiguity,
right,
to this question of kidnapping and enslaving people. I believe that there is no moral ambiguity in the scriptures about unequal weights and measures, which is the essence of what fiat currency is. There is no moral ambiguity about the enslavement of other people to debt. And I think that in the 21st century, that if Christians have already taken the step historically to lead the way to bring down something like the enslavement of others, that, dare I say, this should be the next step for Christians in moving Christian civilization forward, is the abolition of central banking and fiat currency, and a restoration of these pure things. And it's not just me saying it or having high-minded ideals. If you go to the Old Testament and look at the exile of Judea to Babylon, and you read Isaiah chapter 1, look carefully, you'll see that the core of the moral corruption in Judea started when they started debasing their currency. And if you just read a contemporary prophet to Isaiah, Micah, in Micah chapter 6, he talks about the statutes of Ahab and Omri. Through the lens of economics, you can read that passage and say, oh, wait a minute. These are all consequences of a debased currency. And then finally, on the flip side, on the other side, you read the prophet Ezekiel, and he's given instruction from the Lord that when the princes return to Jerusalem to rebuild that city, the first thing they have to do to restore justice is to restore equal weights and measures. And God even names the weights of the metals in a shekel. It says, this is your money, and don't alter it. So through that pattern of what we see in the Old Testament, the exile happening because of the consequences of inflation, and then on the promise of return, do it right. Do it in God's way. Do not distort your money, because this is abhorrent to the Lord. An unequal weight or measure is an abomination to the Lord. And so as Christians, if slavery is an abomination and we sought its abolition, so too are unequal weights and measures. And in this next generation, I hope that for the sakes of our children, because now we see the long run impact of inflation, that we will abolish central banking as well. And so that's my case for why Christians should not just say, well, let's reform it. Oh, wag your finger at the Fed when they don't push interest rates the way we want. No, abolish the whole thing and come back to sound weights and measures and money. And I'm happy to see that there are folks who have studied in the Austrian tradition who are building some of those solutions. But that's my hope. That's my prayer.
That's a beautiful way to end this. I do want to ask you, since you've done a lot of research on this, about some resources that you would recommend for Christians who want to learn more about this. Obviously, Guido Hulsmann's book, The Ethics of Money Production, is fantastic. It is a little technical in places, so if you're brand new to economics, it might be a tough place to start. But I can just imagine that there are people listening to this episode right now, because I do have people that aren't like hardcore Austro-libertarians that listen to this podcast. But I would imagine that after listening to this, you got to kind of be convinced about how bad this is for everybody.
I pray that's the case.
Yeah. So what are some resources that you would recommend for people that want to learn more, and in particular, maybe Christians that don't have a baseline knowledge of economic theory?
Well, I think a great place to start on this question is Murray Rothbard's "What Has Government Done to Our Money?" And it's a short, I call it a pamphlet, especially since I assign it to our students. I'm like, it's not a book, it's a pamphlet. Right. You'll get through it. And by the time they read through it, they are astonished. Yeah. They have great clarity and understanding, but they're also a little animated, especially around questions of biblical justice. So I think that's a great place to start. What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray Rothbard. We brought up the connection to the warfare state. Now, this is a book that's a little more obscure and difficult to find. You can find What Has Government Done to Our Money for free PDF at Mises.org. But I read a book on the warfare state a couple years ago from a Baptist minister who proposed a resolution to oppose World War I. And his name is J.J. Taylor. And the title of the book is The God of War. And making that, if you read Rothbard and then read The God of War, I think that connection between inflationism and the warfare state would really grip your heart and mind. And then from there, when it comes to inflation, I think when we think about solutions, that Gary North's book, Honest Money, has been a helpful one to me, where Gary North, I know that not everybody is a fan of his, but and there's different reasons for it, but on this topic, I think it's a great place to go. Honest Money. And there he's doing a very fine and clear biblical exposition on some of the passages I mentioned, but also how God's heart is for justice. And you can't have economic justice if you have unequal weights and measures at the core of your financial and exchange system. And so Gary North's Honest Money is another good one. And I think those are three good places to start. And I hope that listeners will really engage with this topic and have a sense of the moral indignation, not just from you and I, but get a sense of the Lord's heart, right? The Lord's heart towards questions of justice, towards the abuses that, as Isaiah says, when princes become companions with thieves and create this kind of financial system, it doesn't bode well for your family, your community, your church, or your nation, and that's where we're at.
Well, Dr. Degner, I really appreciate your time today. This has been an incredible conversation. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. So that's maybe not the first place people would go to. I am on X or Twitter, and I am actually in the process of developing a website here as well and getting some of my stuff out there. But in the dean's role here at Cornerstone University, I definitely stay busy, but I think these are important things to get out there to folks and, Lord willing, have an impact on churches and the way that our brothers and sisters think about these topics. So those are the spots you can find me.
All right. Well, Dr. Degner, thanks for coming on the show today.
Appreciate it, Alex. Thank you for the invitation.